So one of the central questions of the cognitive sciences is how do words get their meaning? And this is a question that I've long been interested in and took me on an unexpected journey through the world of robots, babies, and ultimately, of all things, Twitter and TV. And my way to enter into this question of words and meaning was through artificial intelligence. And going back to my days in grad school at MIT, the sort of dominant approach for getting a machine to understand what words mean was to essentially take some form of symbolic definition, like a dictionary definition, and encode networks of these into the machine. And the problem with that is, or so the limitation of that approach is pretty obvious. Up here is a set of dictionary definitions starting with the word push. So if you want to get a machine to understand what it means to push something, and you take all of the dictionary definitions, of course they all are eventually circular. The more basic the concept, the more quickly you find circularity. So there's got to be something more to word meaning than that. And so that led to a whole research program in building robots. So this is Ripley, a second-generation robot we built.
Ripley had to do what? Which good one? So that one.
And so Ripley had a little bit of dialogue structure, but what we're really after is creating computational models where the meaning of words like push and heavy and blue could be grounded in what the robot could make of its world through its sensory motor system. And so what we're actually doing, and I thought this would be a relevant slide since we are here in the birthplace in many ways of semiotics. Almost a century ago, Eugen Richards, a philosopher-linguist, first forwarded this idea of what became known as the Semiotic Triangle, that there is no causal relationship between words in the world. What mediates words in the world are thoughts. And so people map thoughts from what they see and touch in the world and then connect that to words, and that the connection between words and the world are actually always mediated by thoughts. And what we were doing by building robots was essentially modeling this process, or a mechanistic version of exactly this kind of interaction. Of course, Eugen Richards and this whole tradition of semiotics was not focused on robots. They were focused on people. And as we started building more elaborate models of machine learning, of sort of grounded language, I became interested in how kids learn language as a place to really get inspiration for building better robots. But eventually my interest pivoted into just becoming fascinated with what it is that kids do to break the code of language. And so we started studying kids, including eventually my own son. So thousands of little interactions like this as my son starts to crack the code of what blue and ball mean. What we're able to do, because as we're pursuing this idea, emerged the so-called era of big data. I didn't know it was called that at the time, but in 2005, as we were expecting our first child, we were able to wire up our house. And so you're looking through cameras looking down into our home and solve various both technical challenges, privacy issues for how to collect what ended up being about 250,000 hours of multi-channel audio and video from throughout our house. And with a record of essentially 2 years of life in our home, we're able to transcribe all of the speech using new tools and track motions through the house and get to a point where we could reconceptualize language acquisition as a continuous process, where we had about 10 million words transcribed through these 2 years of life at home. We could identify every time my son learned to pronounce a new word. We call that a word birth. And then we could trace back in time and study the gestation period of each word and do a systematic study of how the grounding actually led to certain words being acquired before others. So I'm just going to show you one quick example of what that kind of analysis can look like. You're going to see in a second my son start moving, walking around the coffee table. Our nanny offers him some water. This is an example of him being exposed to the word water, where we also look at the physical context of what's happening as he hears the word water. And then we can trace back through time and look at every time he ever heard the word water and build up a map of the exposure to this word.
You want to go there? All right.
So we tag the moment. You notice as our nanny and my son are moving, it leaves behind these gray lines. We'll get a perspective of the entire house now. And now we start going through our database, finding every time my son heard water, and we're going to ratchet up time so it doesn't take too long to fly through 2 years. And as we interpenetrate the whole life experience of hearing the word water with all of the movement patterns around the house, what emerges is this kind of landscape. We call this a wordscape. And we can build one of these wordscapes for every word my son learned. And what we found in recent analyses is that these wordscapes are the single most predictive variable in determining why he learned certain words before others. And this is actually research that's going to press just now. So let me take you back to the semiotic triangle. So remember, the idea is now really thinking about whether it's a robot or a child or an adult, that the language user has thoughts that map words to the world. But in fact, what we're studying, whether it's a human-robot interaction or, more interesting now to me, human-human interaction, is that there's multiple people involved. And so we might do a little edit and consider what happens when you have two people who have thoughts, that in fact, perhaps a better sort of way to think about the interaction is a kind of semiotic diamond, where you have people and their thoughts that are connected on top through words that they share, and down below through a common experience. And this framework and sort of the dynamic sort of circuit that connects thoughts to thoughts mediated by words in the world became a sort of framework for my lab at MIT to think about a lot of different contexts where sort of this framework applies. And one that emerged, certainly not planned, was to think about the common experience of television and the world of tweets, which is where we ended up finding most of the kind of words flying around that had this shared context and led to, as you heard in the introduction, the creation of Bluefin Labs. So here's what the basic data looks like. People are tweeting more and more as they watch TV. So here's someone tweeting about Mad Men, a popular drama on US television. Here's someone shouting at the top of their all caps lungs as a shot is made in a basketball game. Sometimes people even tweet about provocative television ads. Nike is amazing at generating conversation on television. So what we did, and this is Michael Fleischman, who was actually working on the home video analysis at my lab and ended up being co-founder with me of Bluefin, is we created a map of all the public connections of people through social media platforms. So we had sort of this classic social network. We created a real-time map of all TV content in the US. So each node here is actually depicting an actual show or an ad on broadcast or cable networks in the US. And then sort of the key last ingredient was to connect the content graph of television with the social graph. And each line here is showing actual data of someone who is identified in the public social graph that said something about something on TV at just the right time. So we do semantic analysis of what they're saying. We look at timing of what's on TV. We use all of that to stitch together what we started calling the TV Genome, essentially this kind of comprehensive view of the connections between television and its audience. And this was an analytics capability that we started providing as a service to the TV industry, both to networks and to marketers. Marketers found insight in audiences that they had been building brands on in front of for decades, but they got a new lens into that audience. And television networks similarly started seeing how their content was engaging or failing to engage the audience. So this was Bluefin Labs, which earlier this year was acquired by Twitter. And Twitter acquired Bluefin because it allowed this entire analytics engine, which up to that point was being used really from the outside, just to view and observe and measure, by bringing it into Twitter, we're now able to actually bring this analytics capability across the entire global platform. And so what I'll do now is share with you a couple of examples of how the industry is trying to shift. The way I describe what's happening is that the largest and most pervasive global medium ever made, television, remains king of global media, is beginning to intersect with a global social medium. And the two are beginning to actually shape each other. And the result of that, I think, is a completely new hybrid form of human communication. And we're just sort of at the earliest stages of this integrated new substrate. So I'm going to show you two examples. This is an example of a piece of data from the UK, where we have the X factor and the measured audience that tunes into the show. And this is the opening moments of this particular telecast. And someone who is in the viewing audience of the TV show tweets. So this is Claire Hardy, who tweets about Sharon Osbourne is just the best ever. I'm laughing uncontrollably, she tweets. And what we can do now through the Twitter platform is actually not just know that that tweet was generated, but detect every time that tweet is rendered on a follower's device. And so that first impression delivered, we know exactly who saw it and when. And so if we now trace the life of this tweet over the course of the broadcast of the show, we see that Claire Hardy drove a handful of impressions while the show was airing. And if we look over the next couple of hours, we can see that it drops off pretty quickly. Okay, so what this is doing is looking at not just who's talking about TV, but the impact on a secondary audience, a kind of social amplification of the TV broadcast. So if we now roll back the clock, let's go back to the beginning of the telecast, and we're going to take a 1% sample of the actual viewing audience. You can get a sense of the scale of what's actually happening. So this is 1% of the audience taking their actual data and mapping their tweet activity. And you see this virtual tidal wave of this kind of social amplification. Colored in blue is a subset of audience who both watched the show and tweeted about it. The ratio between the white and the blue is an interesting new way to quantitatively measure the engagement properties of the TV program. If you roll up the impressions data, sort of this much larger mass, we can study the time profile of how impressions are being driven to get a sense of how live and in the moment the actual Twitter platform is as a communication medium. And what we actually see is a large number of impressions, and most of the impressions are being delivered while the show is actually airing. And so we've got a very interesting set of properties and we've already heard, Twitter is clearly a place where you go to talk about what's happening in the moment, so it just mixes well with live television. So beyond measurement, and by the way, Nielsen, which is the currency for measuring television in the United States, last week rolled out a new rating system for television across the US called the Nielsen Twitter TV rating. And so there's really sort of a tipping point that I think we're seeing in terms of how the industry is being shaped. So I'm going to show you one last example here. This is going beyond measurement to how Twitter is actually starting to transform its actual service. So this is a concept, most of which has now been rolled out in the US. So behind, of course, every great broadcast is a network. So ESPN, major broadcaster of sports content in the US, and the ESPN audience loves to tweet. If you think about who's on the receiving end of these tweets, they're not necessarily watching the TV show. What they're doing is following someone who's watching the program. And so this opens up an interesting opportunity for a TV network to have a second and direct communication path to this person who has just heard about something on their program. And because you can embed video in a tweet, a very natural thing to do is essentially break off a little piece of live TV that's just aired and embed it in a video, put the video into a tweet, and put it right next to the comment that's just been heard about what's on TV. This becomes an invitation for people to tune in to what's on TV, and even if they don't, a little piece of television has just entered into the live reach network of Twitter. And so we have this kind of organic in blue, what I like to call the social soundtrack, the synchronized conversation of people naturally talking to each other as they watch TV, and this engineered new communication pathway that allows a television network to sort of organically extend itself into the interactive world of Twitter. So just in conclusion, just coming back to this idea of the semiotic diamond, so what's running through all of these different pieces of work is, if you set aside TV and Twitter and kind of all of the technology enhancements that we're going through, underlying is a very basic human dynamic. And I like to think about, before there was television, there were broadcast events. And perhaps the original broadcast event may be the sunset. And if you think about the difference of seeing a sunset alone versus with a companion, for example, if I were standing in front of the sunset with my daughter, who's now 6, and she was to point out the pretty little orange cloud, the meaning of orange and cloud are grounded in that physical thing, in this case, the sunset. And so in a sense, meaning flows from the sunset to the words, gives the words meaning. But it's a two-way dynamical system. The fact that my daughter just brought my attention to that cloud may potentially transform my experience of the sunset. The way I perceive and remember that sunset could be changed completely. And I think we all have that intuition that the social medium, that social interaction can affect the primary experience. And that is exactly what we're seeing in the world of television. So when a show, I think this is Glee, has millions of people in conversation, Glee, that piece of television, is just like the sunset, that broadcast event. But now, the natural act of communicating with one another goes through this sort of superhuman extension with something that Twitter allows, this live public communication platform, to allow a television network to reach an audience that's connected, a networked audience, which never has been possible before, and takes this semiotic diamond interaction and takes it to a whole new scale. And so what I think we're starting to see at the intersection of television and TV is sort of the impact of the semiotic diamond writ large. Thank you.
You know, Deb, you've made everybody in here who's a parent feel incredibly guilty about being so inattentive. Now, I know you're not allowed to say anything about Twitter and its IPO, which is coming up, but just a quick question. How important do you see the tracking of real-time TV activity to the future of Twitter as a business?
It's certainly emerged as a very important and central element of Twitter's focus today. And I think that, television represents kind of a more general class of sort of opportunity and so where Twitter makes a lot of sense, which is any broadcast event creates a synchronized experience. And I think synchronicity is really what's at the heart of why television is so important. So it is important to Twitter, but more generally, anytime, and right now we're having a synchronous experience. Everyone here is being forced to hear my broadcast. And that creates a shared context in the moment. And of course, what makes this whole sort of broadcast event have value is not so much what's coming from the stage, but all the interactions that we'll all have as active audience members. And so that's really, I think, a sweet spot for Twitter. And I think that if you kind of look at media consumption, television for sure, over its history, television viewing has become a less and less social affair. And it's really the individual drive and to have what you want, so content gets splintered, where you want it, so there's place shifting, TVs everywhere, when you want it, time shifting. All of those individual conveniences roll up to the social dimension getting hit more and more. And I think that we are all craving to resynchronize and reconnect. And so one of the things that Twitter has sort of really just fallen into, luckily, is that hunger to reconnect. And it's interesting, it's not just media consumption that's become less social. All this applies to food consumption, right? Food as you want it, where you want it, when you want it. There's kind of food streaming now, the idea of kind of meals where you come together. And so the social dimension, as technology lets us get our individual way, there's this kind of hidden consequence. So I think Twitter is, in many ways, filling that desire.
One last quick question. So people here are tweeting. We have the hashtag WiredUK13. Could you tweak the algorithm so we could trend globally?
I'll get right on that.
All right. Deb Roy.
Thank you.